Well, hey everybody, welcome once again to Adult Bible Class. I'm so glad that you're carving out some time to be in God's Word. Our teacher for Adult Bible Class today is Dr. Jeff Kloa. He's the Chief Curatorial Officer of the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. And until Easter, he's going to be leading us through a fabulous study based in the Gospel of Mark on the final days of Jesus on this earth, the time that he moves toward the cross. The study is called Following to the Cross. It's going to be an in-depth study full of insight and wisdom from Dr. Kloa. And so, as we kick off today's study, here's our teacher, Dr. Kloa.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our new Bible study series, Following to the Cross, Mark chapters 11 through 16. My name is Jeff Kloa, and I'm honored to be joining you again for this Bible study series at Concordia. Thanks to Pastor Bill and Pastor Zach for asking me back again. We did a study of Philippians in the fall, and for the next several weeks, actually the next about 8 weeks or so, we'll take a journey step by step through the Gospel of Mark, beginning at chapter 11, where Jesus enters Jerusalem, all the way through his resurrection in chapter 16. It's an amazing book, amazing section of Mark's Gospel, and I'm really excited to be able to share it with you. Just a little bit about myself so you know who I am. My work is here in Washington, D.C. Actually, we live in Arlington, D.C., or Arlington, Virginia. You might peek out of the corner of my window, and about 2 blocks that way is the Pentagon, so it's always interesting being this close to things, especially the last couple of weeks. My wife and I live here in Arlington, and my work is at Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., which we, of course, invite you to visit. But for the series, I'm really coming to you more as just a teacher of the Bible. My background in teaching is professor of New Testament at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis for 18 years. Taught Bible study, including Mark, numerous times at different congregations. And prior to being at the seminary, I was a pastor in Cleveland, Ohio for 6 years. So been around the block a little bit and really enjoy the opportunity to teach the Bible and help you think through what this means for us today. I'm especially excited about this study of Mark. Mark is really my favorite gospel, if it's okay to have a favorite gospel. It's very quick, it's very intense, things happen. Jesus does just really cool stuff, and Mark's the evangelist's artistry in composing the gospel, by the inspiration of the Spirit, is so skilled and so informed that he really walks us through what Jesus' life and teachings mean for us. So a couple highlights in Mark's Gospel, just to kind of get you set up so you know the orientation as we go through the book. Mark was written primarily to Christians, actually. It's not written as an evangelistic tool, really. It's written to people who know something about Jesus already. Now, it's not to say it's not helpful if you're not familiar with Jesus' life, or you're not a Christian even, or new to the faith. But Mark assumes that his audience already knows something about Jesus, and in fact, they're struggling in some ways. He's writing to people who are dealing with uncertainties, perhaps even persecutions in places. And we'll see that reflected as we go through this journey into Jerusalem and beyond. And we'll point out as we go through those sections where that comes up earlier in the gospel. So I think it's an especially important and relevant book to study today because, like those first century Christians who first heard Mark's gospel, we deal with uncertainty. We deal with challenges. So even though the situation that we face in our world today in America is not necessarily outright hostile physical persecution, nevertheless, we all know that it's not easy to be a Christian in the current environment. It's not easy to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, in particular, the way that Jesus describes it in the gospel. So I think it's especially helpful in our life of learning what it means to follow Jesus. I also really appreciate that the Gospel of Mark focuses on Jesus in a very specific way. He has a specific purpose in writing this book so that we come to understand Jesus better and know what it means to follow him, and especially, above all else, to trust in the promises of Jesus. I'd like you to kind of keep that in mind as we read through Mark together, as you read through it on your own. Just kind of keep this question in mind. Every time Jesus says he's going to do something, what happens? When he says that the disciples will go ahead of him into Jerusalem and find a donkey tied up, and you're going to take it, and the owner is going to ask you what you're doing, will that actually happen? When Jesus curses a fig tree, will it actually wither and die? When Jesus says that the temple will be destroyed and in 3 days it will be built up again, does that happen? So as we go through Mark, just really pay close attention, and I'll help you point these out. Pay really close attention to when Jesus says something will happen. And we'll see how that helps us to rely and trust in what Jesus promises to us. So it's a great book. It's a fantastic book to learn about discipleship and what it means to be a follower of Jesus, in a really exciting section of the Gospel of Mark. In some ways, you got kind of the greatest hits, if that's, you could use that phrase, of things in Jesus' ministry. So we're going to hear in these 5 chapters, we're going to see the entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, Jesus riding on a donkey, that unforgettable image. We're going to see Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple, very dramatic and even violent. Jesus is going to talk about taxes, always an interesting topic. He's going to talk about resurrection, always an important topic to have nailed down. He's going to tell us what the greatest commandment is. We're going to hear about the widow's mite. We're even going to hear about the end times in chapter 13. And of course, then all the key events around Jesus' death, the Last Supper, the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, the betrayal by Judas with a kiss, the trial before Pilate, the flogging and the mockery of Jesus, his crucifixion, and of course, his resurrection. So there's an awful lot crammed into these 6 chapters, 5 chapters, whatever it is. And so you'll forgive me if we go, pretty carefully through this, because there's so much packed into this. And so the pace you can expect as we go through this over the next number of weeks is I really hope to cover, a couple of stories a week, if you can put it that way. So the entrance into Jerusalem and the visiting the temple all happens on one day, and the cleansing of the temple happens the next day. So kind of take those as a unit. We'll go on and go section by section to cover these. The chapters get longer as we go through this. Almost the pace of the book slows down a little bit. It's kind of interesting how that happens throughout the book. But that's about what you can expect. We'll cover, again, about a couple of stories a week. And we'll try to do this. I'm going to keep myself this time to 45 minutes per session. Okay, 45 minutes, 40 to 45, just like Pastor Bill and Pastor Zach does on Sunday morning for the online service. You kind of know what to expect. And I'm also going to, if I can pull the slide up here, invite you to email questions to me directly. And I'll put the email up at the end of the session today. And then you can send me questions based on the text here, and I will add those to the next session as a kind of a beginning point. We tried to do that a little bit last time, and it had to go through Pastor Zach and texts, and it didn't always kind of work out. So I just created an email address for this, and you can reach out to me directly with questions. So that's where we're at. Thank you again for joining me, and let's get started. So if you open your Bibles to Mark chapter 11, we're going to start with verse 1 in chapter 11. Be helpful if I had a Bible, right? So there we go. Mark 11, verse 1. Now, when they drew near to Jerusalem, okay, they drew near to Jerusalem. On the screen, we've got a drawing of what first century Jerusalem looked like, more or less. It's pretty well documented archaeologically and in different descriptions. Let me give you a bigger picture here so you can see it. And let me get this right. There. And just to point a couple of things out, on the, let's see, the right side of the screen, I think as you'll be looking at this, where you see the number 11 and 12, that's the Mount of Olives. So as Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, that's the direction he's coming from. That would be basically to the east of Jerusalem. And as he's coming over that hill of the Mount of Olives, he's looking down into a valley, and then rising up on the other side is that square, very large complex in the kind of center top of the drawing there, which is the Temple Mount. That is built by King Herod, who by this point in Jesus' life is no longer around. He passed away sometime before. But that's where the temple is located. It's the first thing you see, the dominant thing you see as you come over the Mount of Olives from the east. And that portion actually is still visible today. If you see the number 7 there, kind of in the center of the screen, again near the top, that's the wall of the platform that the temple was built upon. And the temple is gone. We'll talk about that in chapter 13. That was destroyed about 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. But the platform, the very large platform that was built as a foundation for the temple, that is still there. And you might be familiar with this as the Wailing Wall. That section that you see in the news or in photos that still today, the Wailing Wall. It's the section of the temple platform that was closest to the temple itself. And so it holds a very special place for Jewish people to this very day. The rest of what you see on that drawing is pretty much gone today. The basic contours are there, the upper city to the left, King David's city on the right, kind of going down the hill from the temple platform. There are walls today around the old city of Jerusalem. Some of those follow the Herodian walls, the walls that were there in the first century, but some of those were moved and rebuilt by later rulers, especially Saladin and when Jerusalem was conquered by the Muslims. One other area I'll point out now, and if I can point this out, I don't have a way to do this on a screen. But if you look in the, where you see the N, the arrow right underneath the word Jerusalem, you see a couple of towers kind of notched out there in that notch before the wall goes around to the north. That little notch out there is where the first century walls ended, and almost certainly the spot where Jesus was crucified. Today, that's inside the old city. The walls, Jerusalem was extended and built out larger, so it's now inside the walls, and that's where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located today. If you've been to Jerusalem, And as we'll see, that's actually a pretty likely spot for where Jesus was crucified. So I point all this out to give you a little bit of context. We're dealing with uh, a, a series of events around a person, Jesus of Nazareth, who's known in history, actual human being who's documented outside the Bible. And all these events for the next 5 chapters happen in this location, which we can reconstruct pretty accurately. Not the houses and things, but the main structures and the boundaries, the walls, those kinds of things. We know where all that was. And we're in a pretty small spot. This is not a big place. I should have looked up actually the kind of acreage of Jerusalem. But I would estimate that you could walk from the Western Wall to where I just pointed out the crucifixion in about 4 minutes. I mean, it's not a long way by any means. It's just a couple of city blocks, really. So this is a very tight area, very compressed, and so much meaning and significance is built up on this spot, as we'll see when we go through the Gospel of Mark. This city of Jerusalem is both a theological, from the Old Testament, so much theological richness and hope built up into this, and anticipation for the future. But it's also quite a political tinderbox, as we'll see, with the Romans who now control the territory and see Jerusalem and its inhabitants and the temple as a bit of a problem, actually, that needs to be managed. And we'll see a lot of that dynamic happening in these chapters in Mark. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, you obviously you get a sense for the scale here. I hope you have the chance to go sometime, and we'll show you some photos and things later on of what that looks like as we go through the study. But that's where we're going to be for the next several Sundays as we go through this study in Jerusalem, this little place with so much meaning and significance. And of course, in verse 1, Jesus comes near to Jerusalem. This is the first time that he actually goes to Jerusalem in the Gospel according to Mark. We know from especially the Gospel of John that he made at least 2 other trips. He might have made, 2 other trips, and then Luke tells us that he was there when he was 12. It's actually very likely that Jesus and his family went to Jerusalem every year around the time of Passover. That's simply what you did. It was one of the pilgrimage feasts in the Jewish calendar. But in Mark's gospel, he chooses to tell us that Jesus only goes there once. And I think there's a reason for that. It's not that he's hiding information or being deceitful or something. But in Mark's gospel, there's this progression of Jesus to the cross that starts right from the first verse and is woven through the 10 chapters until he crests over the Mount of Olives and lays eyes on Jerusalem for the first time. So there's this buildup, there's this anticipation for Jerusalem that something is going to happen there, something significant, something major. And the questions that have been cropping up around Jesus will be answered once he makes it to Jerusalem. So for the rest of the time today, what I'll do is we're going to kind of pause on Mark 11, verse 1, and come back to that next week. But for the rest of the time today, I'm going to show you some highlights in Mark's gospel that build us up to jump into Jerusalem. Okay, so keep in mind we're starting after 10 chapters. So Mark, the evangelist, again, is assuming that you've heard all this before and have been prepared by hearing the rest of the story. Now, I encourage you, of course, just to go ahead and read this on your own. Go ahead and read Mark. It doesn't take very long. couple hours, 2.5 hours. You can download it and listen to it, or you could even go to YouTube and watch people doing a performance of Mark, just literally performing verbatim the words of Mark. It can be very effective. I know we watch Netflix, and you binge watch. I don't know, The Crown. I guess I don't know. I didn't think much of The Crown. Got a little boring for me, but anyway, you could binge watch Netflix for 3 hours. You can certainly, you know, watch or listen to the Gospel of Mark for a couple hours. So I encourage you to do that. Right, just take a little time out, listen to Mark, and read Mark, watch Mark, and again, pay attention to those times when Jesus says something is going to happen. We'll come back to that. But again, for the rest of the day, I'm going to give you some of those highlights so we're prepared to enter into Jerusalem ready to understand what Jesus is doing. So what I'll ask you to do is to take your Bible and turn to Mark chapter 8. And there's a handful of verses there that in many ways summarize the key themes in the Gospel of Mark. It's a remarkable passage, actually. It starts at verse 27, and I'll go ahead and read it, so just kind of track along with me. By the way, I'm just going to use the ESV translation for the Bible study. I've got my Greek over here. If we need to pull it out, we'll pull it out, but by and large, a text like Mark, it's pretty straightforward for translation, although we can highlight a few things from the Greek as we go. But Mark 8:27. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. So just pause. He's up north of the Sea of Galilee. And on the way, he asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, get this question now, he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Now, I'm going to pause there. That's the first, and in some ways, there's three sides to the question of what needs to be answered from the Gospel of Mark. And this is the first part of the question, that is, who is this man? Keep in mind, for 8 chapters now, Jesus has been doing all kinds of cool stuff, right? He's healed lepers. He's made blind people see. He's cast out demons. He made the lame man walk that was lowered to the ceiling. He's fed 5,000 people, and then he fed 4,000 more. He's done these amazing things. So of course, right, there's something about this guy that's unusual, and people who he's encountering are giving all kinds of answers. And so when Jesus asks the question, the disciples just repeat some of those back. Well, you're Elijah, or you're John the Baptist, or one of the prophets, or you're somebody important, but we can't quite put our finger on it. And then Jesus asks the question that actually matters. Not what do other people say, but you. And I said I wouldn't do Greek, but in Greek, this actually gets emphasized by the way the words are placed and by repeating a word, which you can't do in English. The way it goes in Greek is, "But you, who do you say that I am?" So there's a very direct question put to Peter, a personal question put to the disciples. He's not interested in what you think other people say about him. He's interested in what you say about him. And then Peter gives an answer. Peter, of course, is usually the guy who speaks out for the disciples. Usually it doesn't turn out very well, as we'll see. Turns out okay, don't worry, but it usually doesn't turn out very well until Jesus fixes things. We'll get to that. So Peter answers, "You are the Christ." Now, I'm sure as he's standing before Jesus, he doesn't say it that way, right? You are the Christ, very matter of factly. But how did he say it, right? Did he say it with confidence, right? You are the Christ, ba, 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 trumpets, confetti falls down. Peter gets the quiz show answer right, and he wins the grand prize. Is that the kind of answer Peter gives? Or is it something more like this, right? Who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ? Well, why does it matter, right? It matters because of what Jesus says next. He strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Why? Well, because Peter, as we'll find out in just a moment, doesn't quite understand what it means to be the Christ. In the very next verse, Jesus will go on to tell him what the Christ will do. So the second question, what is he doing? Verses 31 to 33. He began to teach them that the Son of Man, we'll talk about that phrase later, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly, or very obviously is kind of a way to say that. Plainly, not in a sense of matter of factly, but plainly in a sense of I'm laying this out as clearly as I can possibly make it, right? I'm going to go to Jerusalem. Well, he doesn't say Jerusalem yet. We'll get there. Son of Man must suffer, be rejected, be killed, and after 3 days rise. So there's the answer to the question, what is he doing? He's going to be killed, and he's going to rise. So what does Peter do? And this is why we have to go back and think about how he answered that question, you are the Christ, right? Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now, just stop there for a second. Peter takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. Just off the top of your head, do you think it's a good idea to rebuke Jesus? Just kind of think about this for a second, right? What does Jesus do? Turning and seeing his disciples, or looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And again, you can see how this works, right? So what does Peter do? Let me try the video here. Here. So I'm going to try to visualize this for you, right? So I'm standing here by myself, but Peter takes Jesus aside, right? He's got his arm around him, and he takes him aside, and he starts rebuking him. Okay, and the disciples are back there, wondering what Peter's telling Jesus, right? So here's Jesus, here's Peter. Okay, now Jesus, after Peter rebukes him, here's Jesus. He turns around. So Peter is now back there, and he's looking at the disciples, and Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking the things of God, but the things of men." So literally, Jesus has turned his back on Peter because Peter had rebuked Jesus. Let me get back in front here. Because Jesus had rebuked Peter for saying what he said about what he is doing. So it's a pretty dramatic scene. And let me kind of step into Peter's defense here for a second. He could not possibly comprehend that this is what Jesus was coming to do. I mean, again, for 7.5 chapters, he's been doing all kinds of cool stuff, huge crowds, right? Everything's going great. Why, if Jesus is the Christ, would he possibly be rejected and die? And what the heck are you talking about with the resurrection? I mean, that just makes no sense. So Peter just can't fit what Jesus is doing into his brain. And so he rebukes Jesus. And what does Jesus do? Well, he calls that satanic because that's completely against what God has called him to do. If he were to not do that, if he were not to go to the cross and suffer and die and rise. So when Peter says you are the Christ, back up there in verse 29, right? He got the multiple choice question right. Are you Elijah? Are you a prophet? Are you John the Baptist? Are you the Christ? Tick a box. You're taking the SAT and you got to fill in a circle somewhere. So Peter fills in the right circle. But if it were an essay question, would Peter have gotten it right? Well, no, because he's expecting the fantastic Jesus, the winner Jesus, the guy who's going to fix everything for all our people and for me. That's the kind of Jesus, the kind of Christ, the kind of Savior I'm looking for. And Jesus rebukes him. There's something else that he came to do. And then, as if it kind of couldn't get any worse, we get to the third question that's central in the Gospel of Mark, and that gets answered in these few verses. So turn to verse 34. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So, 3 questions. Who is this man? Well, he's the Christ. He's the Son of God. Go turn to Mark 1:1. The answer to that question is in the first verse of the book. What is he doing? Well, he's going to suffer and die and rise from the dead. And how do I respond? Well, I follow. I follow to the cross, even though it's not easy, even though it calls me to sacrifice and to serve and to follow where he leads rather than where I would go. It's a pretty tough section, a pretty challenging section, a lot compressed into there. But we'll see this developed out and laid out in chapters 11 to 16, where Jesus shows us how this is actually possible, where it's made clear who he is on the cross, where he actually does what he said he would do. Remember that theme? When Jesus says he's going to do something, does it happen? Well, let's pay attention and see if he actually is rejected by the elders and the chief priests and killed, and after 3 days rise again. Let's see if that happens. And third, is it possible to follow him? Can anyone do what he calls us to do in denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and following him? How does that happen? I'd like to take a moment to expand on especially that first question. Who is this man? The other two we will see really in detail through chapters 11 through 16. what is Jesus doing, and how do I respond? That gets the big emphasis in chapters 11 through 16. But I'd like to take a moment and focus on that first question, because that doesn't really come up much in chapters 11 through 16, except once, one time in one statement. And it's a really important time, so I want us to be aware of the significance of when it's said and who says it. I'm not going to give it away. We'll save it for the reveal, the unboxing in chapter 15. But I do want to develop a little bit more before we wrap up today. This question, who is this man, and show you where this comes up in Mark. So if you take your Bibles and turn to Mark chapter 4. Fantastic story, and it's a familiar one. But I want to kind of walk through it with the eyes of what's going to happen later on in Jerusalem. So it's a very famous story, Mark 4, verse 35, of Jesus calming the storm. And I've got on the screen did I do this right? Got on the screen it's a picture of Rembrandt's Jesus calming the storm. And I want to reflect on that piece later on, but kind of keep that in mind. It's actually a very theologically rich portrayal. So Mark 4:35. On that day, and that day is after Jesus told a whole bunch of parables about what the kingdom of God is like. So again, he's telling them what he is doing. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, that is to the disciples, let us go across to the other side. So the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he, Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? The Greek there is a little more kind of digging. Is it not a concern to you that we are perishing? Now, let's flesh out the details here. Great windstorm, Sea of Galilee. It's not uncommon. It's a relatively small body of water, and the way it's kind of inside, surrounded by hills, so winds come around and stir things up pretty quickly. So it's not unusual, not surprising that there's a storm. The boat's filling up. The disciples are doing the best they can. But I want to draw out verse 38 a little bit. Jesus was in a stern, asleep on the cushion. Now, I know we commonly think, okay, they brought a cushion along. Isn't that nice? So Jesus can take a nap, right? He's comfy, he's cozy. It's a little surprising that he can sleep with this big storm going on, but it's a nice, pleasant scene. Well, it's actually kind of worse than you think. So the word there for cushion is a proskephalion. And what a proskephalion is, it's a cushion that you put at the very stern of the boat on the bench at the back of the boat, where you have the tiller that steers the rudder. And the cushion allows you to brace against the bench so you can hold the rudder during a storm. And we know exactly what boats from the first century look like on the Sea of Galilee, because they've been able to find some, dug them up. You can go to a museum in Israel today, and next to the Sea of Galilee, and see a first century boat. And sure enough, at the back, you've got a bench, and that's where you'd have the proskephalion, and that's where you would be steering the boat. And in fact, the Greek word proskephalion means literally at the head, at the most important point. So it's not simply that Jesus was sleeping. Okay, that's interesting enough, but he's sleeping at the steering wheel. the only place the disciples would be able to kind of save all this is if they could get Jesus out of the way, get the rudder, and take control of the situation. So is it not a concern to you that, or is it not a concern to you that we are perishing? Is partly a theological answer, but just for Pete's sake, Jesus, get out of the way. Just get up and we'll handle this. So how do you think Jesus is going to respond? Verse 39, he awoke, and notice he doesn't say anything to the disciples. He awoke, and he rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. It's a great phrase. He rebukes the wind and the sea, doesn't say anything to the disciples. Peace, the Greek there, come into a state of stillness, and the wind ceased, and in the Greek again, a great calm happened. A great calm came about. Then, after everything is dead quiet, right? Nobody's saying anything. The disciples have no idea what's going on. Then Jesus, verse 40, says to them, why are you so afraid? You could actually translate that, why are you so cowardly? Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Notice that question. Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? Remember their question to Jesus, is it not a concern to you that we are perishing? Did they not know who he was? Did they not know what power he had? Did he not know what he came to do? Did they think he was just going to die there on the Sea of Galilee? Have you still no faith? Now, how did the disciples respond? They were filled with great fear, and they said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? A couple details to point out. Jesus calms the storm, and they're not relieved. They're not grateful. They're not worshiping him as the creator of the heavens and the earth, which he was. They were filled with a great fear. Interesting response to being saved. And second thing to notice, they said to one another. They don't say anything to Jesus. They don't ask him, who are you? They ask one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Now, think about that for a second. They ask one another who Jesus is. Jesus is standing there on the boat. You think maybe a good way to go would be, hey, Jesus, can you help us out here? Who exactly are you? What did you come to do? What should we expect here? No. Instead, they talk to one another. They pool ignorance and don't ask the person who has all the answers. And then the story ends, right? In chapter 5, they get to the other side of the lake, and the disciples never get the question answered. Who is this man that even the wind and the sea are obedient to him? And so in chapter 8, who is this man? Who do people say that I am? And we get to Jerusalem in chapter 11 on Palm Sunday, and the crowds start calling out, Hosanna to the Son of David. Is that the right answer? Or when he has confrontations with the religious leaders in Jerusalem, are they given the right answer? Or Pontius Pilate questions him. Is that the right answer? Who is this man is finally and clearly answered when we get to Jerusalem. And that's where we'll also find out what he came to do, that is, to finish his work and complete his promises. And we'll also hear, what does it mean to follow him to the cross? So, told you I'd keep to my time. I want to show you this painting and how incredibly well Rembrandt captures the themes in this episode in Mark chapter 4. Here you see the boat, and let me flip this over there. There you see the boat, and at the tiller, actually Rembrandt does a great job depicting it. You see on the right side of the screen the rudder and the tiller extending out. Unfortunately, he depicts it with the disciple holding the tiller, which is incorrect, of course. But what is correct is you notice at the Jesus end of the boat, things are pretty calm. The disciples look like they're kind of having a nice conversation with Jesus. He's, having a cup of tea, and it doesn't look too bad, But you look at the non-Jesus end of the boat, and the waves are crashing, and the guys are flying off the side, and they're grabbing the ropes, and there's complete chaos on the non-Jesus side of the boat. But at the Jesus side of the boat, well, one lump or two. It's very calm. It's very normal. And I think Rembrandt actually captured what the story is about. Where Jesus is calm, is peace, is protection. It's where you want to be. Away from Jesus, at the other end of the boat, that's when you're in trouble. But at the Jesus end of the boat, next to Jesus, is peace, is calm. I think that's what the story is about. So it's an amazing image. And in a few brushstrokes, I think Rembrandt captures what this story is all about. A couple other things to get us ready for chapter 11 next week. We saw in chapter 8 Jesus predict for the first time that he was going to be he was going to suffer, he was going to suffer and be killed, and on the third day rise. He goes on to do this 2 more times in his gospel, and I'll let you, you can put a pause button and read it on your own, or take some notes and read it later on. But he also, in 9:30 through 32, the second time, predicts his death. And again, in 10:32 through 44, right before they go to Jerusalem, he, for the third time, predicts his suffering and death and resurrection in Jerusalem. And so just flip to 10:32 just to see how directly this connects. So verse 32 of chapter 10, they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, right? He's leading the way. And they were amazed. And those who followed were terrified. It's the same word, actually, that we saw at the calming of the storm. They were terrified. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen. We are going up to Jerusalem, right? Let me spell this out. We are going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. Stop. Tuck that away. And again, a question to keep in mind as we go through the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus says something is going to happen, does it happen? Let's just kind of tuck that one aside. In fact, we should probably start a little notepad of all the things Jesus says is going to happen. So Why does Jesus say this 3 times to his disciples? Well, we're going to see this a couple of times in chapters 11 to 16. If something happens 3 times, there's no doubt about it, right? It's kind of like in baseball. 1 strike, yeah, okay. 2 strikes, all right. Choke up a little bit, be ready. 3 strikes, you're out, right? That's it. If something happens 3 times, it's confirmed, right? If one witness says something, yeah, he could make it up. 2 witnesses, they collaborated. But if 3 witnesses say it, then it's right. We're going to see that. Peter denies Jesus 1 time. Okay, it's a mistake. 2nd time, all right, maybe another mistake. You get them all again. But 3rd time, nope, not an accident. So when Jesus says this 3 times, he's driving it home. This is essential. This will happen. Don't lose sight of this. This is why I came. And he's heading straight up to Jerusalem, and he's about to crest that Mount of Olives and look down over the temple. Third question that we see in chapter 8, how do I respond? And there's a lot of ways we can answer this question, a lot of sample passages that we could look at where Jesus lays this out in different ways. We'll see this especially in the end here in chapters 11 through 16. But I'll just toss one out for your reflection, and that's the story that comes right after his 3rd passion prediction, when James and John come up and ask Jesus to be seated at his right and his left in his kingdom. So they're at least 1 + 1 = 2. They've gotten that somehow there's going to be a victory at the end of this for Jesus, and they think that means a victory for them. And so they nuzzle up to Jesus and say, hey, can we sit at your right and your left in your kingdom? And Jesus says, no. And in fact, what you think is the greatest thing to be is the worst. So what's the answer? Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all, or doulos. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus' call to service is one way that we respond. And again, we'll see other ways as we weave our way through Mark's gospel. So I'll leave you with that. Next week, we'll take that step with Jesus and the disciples into Jerusalem, through the crowds, see the waving palm branches, the donkey, the whole thing. And we'll start to see Jesus fulfill what he said he would do, ultimately to the cross and to the empty tomb, and what it means for us. I'm really grateful to do this with you, to walk through this amazing book. It's just a lot of fun to go through this. It's a great book. And so thanks for listening. Thanks for watching along. And I'll leave you with an email address that you can send questions to, or if you read ahead, things you want me to call out. But the email address is Jeff K Bible Study, all one word, Jeff K Bible Study @iCloud.com. So shoot me an email. I'll put some responses together for next week's session, and look forward to talking with you next week. Thanks. Blessings, everyone.
What an incredibly important reminder. As people who follow Christ, we are called to serve just as Jesus has served us. Got a question for you. Who can you serve today? Who can you serve this week and reflect the character and nature of Jesus to them? Thank you so much for joining us this weekend for Adult Bible Class. By the way, as Dr. Chloe said, if you have any questions, you can just send those questions to the email address that's right here at the bottom of your screen. We'll see you next week for Adult Bible Class. God bless you.